Okay, right now I'm just staring at a screen of Dom's name, so we'll wait until some slides come up in front of me maybe before we get started. Anyone? Cool. Okay, it's starting to look like it's happening, don't worry. There we go, awesome. Firstly, I'm really impressed with anyone that can keep this much concentration before lunch, so I'll try and make this as painless as possible. I should also probably start by apologizing to the translators. I speak really quickly in a slightly mixed up accent, so if you don't understand, I'm sorry. Welcome to ask questions later. So what I wanted to do today was talk about optimizing for multiple algorithms. So as the quiet introduction said, my name is Hannah, and I work at an agency called Found. At Found, we're an independent agency who specialize in like SEO and paid and really anything that's going to grow your business. And for me, my role is head of SEO, which means that I'm really in charge of kind of making sure we're at the cutting edge of SEO. Like, I have a great team who do all the work, so it means I have a lot of time to just think, and to think about some of the popular theories in SEO and what we should be doing. My background is relatively mathsy and economics-based, which means that I like to think a lot more about kind of how the algorithm works and reverse engineering it and trying to quantify everything that we do. So, just to start with so we're all on the same page, when I talk about algorithms, I'm just talking about the math that computers are using to decide things that we do. I stole this from a guy's TED Talk. It's a really simple way of explaining exactly what the algorithm means. And what we do as SEOs frequently is we talk about a single Google algorithm, or we talk about a single set of ranking factors. But I think when we talk about it as the algorithm, what we're doing is we're making what we do far too simplistic. There we go. So instead, what I wanted us to do was to talk about something that I call sub-algorithms, but really the components that make up the entirety of the algorithm that we're working with to optimize. So, for example, if you actually read Google's documentation, they do refer to PageRank, Random Surfer, Hilltop, and RankBrain as all independent algorithms. So that means they've got one giant algorithm, and they've mashed all these smaller bits together and added it to it, which is an interesting thing when you think about it, because what we're optimizing for here should be all of these four elements individually. But obviously, there's way more than that, because those are the ones they specifically have ever named as an algorithm, but then there's thousands that we expect as well. So for example, when you start thinking about proximity, and if that's relevant, suddenly a new layer of the algorithm applies that focuses purely on local. But we don't actually see that if we're searching for something that could be a national service. Things like timeliness of the content, and if that's important, the timeliness and whether the query deserves freshness, that doesn't come into account unless it triggers something in the main algorithm to cause that to interact. And there's so many more. So when we think about like how important is a good mobile experience for the query, well, that only matters on mobile. That's when that bit of the algorithm kicks in. So there's thousands of considerations we have to make when we optimize. And what we've done to ourselves as an industry is we've just oversimplified all the moving parts in what we do and made it way harder for us to sell and for people to understand. Like, a lot of my job was pitching, and clients are like, well, why can't you explain it? Why can't you explain why this works? Tell me how many days until I'm number one. Like, that's impossible, but we made it sound dead easy by saying there's just this algorithm that we optimize for, because that's just an equation. Sorry, that bit was really quick. So, in effect, what we're doing is we're competing in these multiple categories, but we never really know when we're triggering each category. And each category is scored completely differently. So what I wanted to do is to pick some of my favorites and try and figure out the rules as part of them and how we can optimize for each bit and what triggers those ones to happen. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about how we optimize when we've triggered the proximities part of the algorithm, engagement, a special bit of the algorithm called deep relevance matching, neural matching, QDF and timeliness, and then also just about how we stay ahead and how we as an agency stay on top of these and make sure what we're doing stays ahead of everything else going on in search. I'm too flamboyant with my clicking. It does not like it. Right, proximity. So proximity for us has 5 core areas, and that's really asking about availability, distance, quality, specialism, and network. So any query where it's something you're going to want local to you, like you're ordering food or you're getting a taxi, it really matters exactly that you hit these criteria, which also means these criteria have to be present on your site. I think the most interesting one here is network. Do people like you go here? So in effect, you have an implied preference as far as Google's concerned. Even if you've never interacted with that brand before, if everyone who interacts with brands that you interact with also prefers that supplier, by default, it will prefer that supplier for you if you're close to it. Which does mean that you have to do a lot more marketing to grow your audience if you're local and really boost that. For local search advice, there's so many people that talk about that in depth, so we're not going to go into it too much, but I would say go and look up Greg Gifford's slides and his blogs on it, because a lot of that is going to help you. So when we're optimizing for it, I think the first thing to start with is the schema that you're applying to the site. So that includes local business markup as well around your proximity. Even if you don't have a physical store as well in GMB, you can put your service area. So for Found, our service area is the whole of Europe, so we've marked that in GMB so that we can rank everywhere. It's also important really for all of this to be as consistent as possible. So if your GMB, Google My Business, says, for example, that you open at 9, but your website says you open at 10, but someone's TripAdvisor reviewed your restaurant and said, actually, they were shut until noon when I got there, that's going to be problematic because it's conflicting signals you're giving to Google. And for Google to recognize your business, even if it is a local business, as an entity, it generally checks something between 50 and 60 signals, and they all have to be consistent. And if you've got all of that consistent markup, that's when they will recognize you as an entity and include you as part of the knowledge graph, which helps you become part of that implied preference. And then, of course, there's reviews and social proof, so making sure that you're basically pushing as hard for local people to be reviewing too, to demonstrate that proximity that you offer. So moving in to look at engagement time as part of the algorithm, any content, video, whatever it is that you have, it will matter how engaged people are when they use it. So we look at things like long clicks and resurface surface rates. We call it pogo sticking, but that return to SERP, where they're jumping onto your content and then jumping back to the search results. As a whole, Google can't use your data like your bounce rate from analytics because it doesn't have access to your GA data or whatever other tracking software you're using. But it will look at that return to SERP, so the return back to the search result. There was a really interesting test run by Rand on this, where he asked a lot of people to test clicking on the second result and then immediately clicking back to the search within a second. And doing that caused that result to start dropping almost instantly in the search results. You shouldn't do it to competitors, but you could. And then, obviously, as well, you've got all of the video analytics, and that means the video analytics that Google's tracking, things like the engagement when the video has been embedded into the SERP, and also the next best action analysis. So we like to look at what people go on to do afterwards, and we track if they've consumed a 30-second video, do they then go off and actually view more of our content, or do they go and do another search? So when you're optimizing for this, what you have to do is really upgrade your content. And instead of just doing content that you like, you need to be doing content that you know your users are going to enjoy. And that means doing things like refining and republishing content, refreshing it as often as you can. It also means on longer pieces of content having heat mapping. So one of the things that we do, whether that's through heat mapping or we do it as a trigger in Google Analytics, we track for people that highlight words. So we work for a lot of B2B businesses who do that terrible consulting stuff. Okay, PwC is a client, so they do the terrible consulting stuff Dom's just talked through, and you have to explain that. And when we're trying to write articles that involve those words, we just want to make sure we're not using too much internal jargon. So we track for when people highlight words, knowing that if they've highlighted it, they've probably gone to Google what it meant. And we make sure that we're clearer in how we're explaining our content to users when we're working in such a difficult sector. It also means that your content has to be in the right format at the right time. So video is great, but actually, a lot of people don't want video when it's B2B or they're in an office. A lot of people don't want video when they're reading at commuting times. So like, if I'm on the tube or the metro in the morning, I really don't want to be loading a video up and watching a video because it's going to buffer. What I want is AMP content that's quick to load, and I can load it between Wi-Fi, between stops. And then I guess the biggest one, and the one that I'm really focused on at the moment, is deep relevance matching. Has anyone heard of deep relevance matching? So either you're all asleep or no one has. I'm going to go with no one has because then it's going to really help the rest of the talk. So deep relevance matching is actually a model that Google has patented as one of its algorithms. It openly claims that it doesn't use it, but when people apply the deep relevance matching model according to the patent on top of the search results, what you see is it's definitely part of the algorithm. It's well worth reading SEO by the Sea. Bill's done some really detailed analysis of how that works, or if you can bear it, go and read the actual Google patent about it. So what deep relevance matching models do is they take away looking at the network of how things link together, and instead they just look at what they call the Q term and the D term, which is literally just a fancy way of saying the query versus the words in the document. And they match those in terms of, does it answer the question? And then they match those in terms of context around the piece. So it's less about having external links pointing in and more about having a hyper relevant site. Now, obviously, links and all those other factors of technical SEO are still important, but according to this model, it's actually just as important to be putting the right content on your site for the user and focusing on the intent, making sure you match what the user actually wanted to see. And so when you're optimizing for this, what we suggest is that you go up the funnel with the content that you're creating. So we look at the people also ask related queries. One of the ways we do that is we use a Chrome extension called Data Miner, just because it's free and you can scrape all the search results for the people also ask and all of the links out and any questions that are appearing in the SERP. We also use Data Miner for social listening. So we'll type a series of queries and groups into things like LinkedIn and Facebook, and we can scrape using Data Miner to pull the information out for what people are talking about. And then we create content according to those questions, and we use the questions as headings, and we put it in the language that the users are asking. And we talk about competitors as well. So we worked for an SEO software who kept getting hit with the fact that their pricing was more expensive, and the most common search was their brand name versus Bright Edge pricing. And it was people comparing the two models. So instead, we just actually gave them a blog post on it. We met the user's intent, firstly. And then obviously as well, you need to be building your brand trust so that you build that relevancy. And that means things like having your organization schema, having semantically created content, and things like updating Wikipedia and making sure you're submitted to Wikidata. Let's not do that. And then we're going to talk about how that kind of ties into neural matching, which is the fourth part of the algorithm that we're going to talk about. Does anyone know what neural matching is? There's like 2 people. This is good. People are waking up. So neural matching is when you don't know what the word for something is, and Google fills in the word for you. So this is actually Google's own example. Oh, you can't read that, can you? Because I can't. So Google's own example is, why does my TV look strange? If a user types in, why does my TV look strange? The results that Google return are almost identical to if the user searched, what is the soap opera effect? And that's because Google has decided that the phrase soap opera effect has the exact same intent as your TV looking strange. So what it's doing is it's applying, basically, knowing what the user meant and what word they were looking for. It's the same as when you're learning a language and you start to describe around the word you can't remember the translation for. It's exactly that, and Google's helping users by giving them the information that they might possibly want in advance. And in doing this, it also, in some SERPs, but not this one, it will bold the soap opera effect as well, even though you didn't include it in the original query. So it shows that that synonym detection has got smarter. So in October last year, Google claimed that 30% of their queries was applying this neural matching logic over the top of it, and that it was learning from itself, and that this would be rolled out across nearly all queries within a few years. And we see this happening more and more often now. So Google is managing to give users what they want before they even know it themselves, which definitely ties in with this trend of Google becoming an assistant, Google helping people to get the information that they need. Come on. And then the ways that we optimize for that, really. Firstly, we start with social listening. So we look at what are people asking for related to our products, and we also do sentiment analysis. We make sure that we understand the emotion we're making them feel, and why they're using the certain words that they are. So for one of our clients, they wanted to do a piece of work that was called The Future of the Workforce. And we told them that's great, but what you're actually talking about is machines taking over. You're not talking about the future of the workforce at all. You're talking about automation. And if you use a catchy marketing phrase, quite often you miss the intent of actually what users could be looking for in order to discover you. A bit like what Don was talking about optimizing for the SERP, not just the user. It's got to be a balance. And then we also look at things like what problems people face with our products, and we make sure we tackle it early on. And the reason we do this is because queries, when they're longer, tend to be question-based, which means they tend to be problems, to be perfectly honest, or research. And it's important to address it as quickly as possible. And then we do our content research through things like forums and social media and competitors, and look for contextual relevance. Now, the reason we do this is because we want to make sure that we're still using the terminology that users are actually entering into the search. For forums, what we do is we use advanced query operators. And with an advanced query operator, such as in URL, with a competitor's site, and then we put the keyword in, and then we scrape all the search results that come out at the end. And that pulls for us information about what they've written about the topic, what we should be writing about the topic. If you do that to forums, like, do you have Quora? If you do it to Quora, what you could do is you can actually search every question that's come up about a particular product on Quora and know that you should be ranking for that organically and start producing that content accordingly. So then, moving on to just talk about QDF and timeliness. So QDF, I realize that acronyms might not translate. QDF means the query deserves freshness. So it's all about actually whether Google thinks that that should be an up-to-date new piece of content, or whether the historic stuff you've written is still relevant. And a lot of queries do have quite a short relevancy window. In particular, like around newsworthy events and the build-up to events. So most interestingly, what we found is like around elections when people are writing, that if you have an AMP page before an election, it will rank well as newsworthy content, but then on the day of the election, you find that AMP often gets displaced with live blogs, and live blog schema is the thing that takes the top position instead. So it's about understanding how the SERP is changing. We like to kind of score a volatility score of a search result, in particular around events. So what we do is we track how much positions 1 to 10 are changing every day. And we track that for like a month, and then we get to understand which positions switch in and out the most, and therefore which ones have the most freshness required. As no one's changing their website that much. And some content just critically has to remain up to date if you want it to keep ranking. In particular, legislation, government pieces, medical advice, things like that. Things that fall into the your money, your life category most frequently as well. So when you're optimizing for this, like you can start with the basics and looking at keyword trends and how the rankings vary. But typically you're only going to get a keyword trend for a month, and a lot of this varies day by day or even weekly. So again, we use social listening and we look at content trends that we see for frequency of posting, and then we look at that change in demand against the time of year as a baseline. We also revisit our content quarterly. We do a performance review where we audit and edit. And we track how our traffic, engagement, and goal completions have changed as well. Like, how do our goal completions against a certain piece of content vary in June compared to in September? And we do that through setting up a lot of goals in analytics as well to do with our content performance. So we have a lot of scroll depth measures. We have a lot of eye tracking on the site. Anything that we can do that helps give the content a value is what's really going to help drive us forward. And then we build forwards from intent. So we assess the intent of the query against what ranks and then against the information available. That helps us determine that we've updated correctly. And we optimize towards that, and we continually reassess that. So in the UK, there's a term called talent management. And talent management experienced a big shift where a lot of human resourcing companies thought that they wanted to rank for that term. But simultaneously, a lot of people that managed like singers and actors also wanted to rank for that term. And there was pretty much a couple of days in the SERP where Google switched it. And there had to be a decision where literally you were like, should I optimize for that term anymore or not? And then it switched back to being purely singers and actors. So Google was running an intent test, and a lot of people saw how that went. So it's important that you continually query what else ranks and if it has the same purpose as what you were ranking for. So then when it comes to staying ahead, this is probably the hard bit. It's really easy-ish to do SEO once you have all the data that other people have collected, and once you have all of the studies that everyone else has done, and once you can also analyze what your competitors are doing. But if we want to be ahead, I think the best thing you can be doing is staying on top of Google's patents. So Google have patents on these three things. In particular, understanding the role of media in content. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're using them. It doesn't translate into parts of the algorithm or things you should be doing, but it does show you the types of themes that Google's looking at. So if Google's writing a patent about how reputation and engagement correlate, then perhaps it's time you should think about making sure your reputation's being built up online too. Patents are really difficult to read because they're really, really long, and they fill them with enough jargon that the average user can't understand them. So a lot of sites out there do analyze them and kind of give you a nice summary of how they actually work. And you can also always ask questions about a patent, and if you go to someone from Google, one of the engineers with the patent, and say, what do you think this phrase means? It's a lot more specific a question than, hey, how do I rank? And I think what we really have to kind of wrap up with is knowing that we can't rely on a single algorithm to service everything. So we like to think that there are two main threads to what we optimize for. So we optimize for our traditional blue links and our traditional SEO ranking factors, and we really care about our technical integrity and our backlinks and all of that in order to make sure we nail those down. And we also make sure that we do things like really good meta descriptions to get the click-through rates up. We do brand building for those too. And then we believe that the top part of the search results, the things that are driven as like answer boxes, anything that's topic cards that have come down from the knowledge graph, we use more of the deep relevancy matching models for them, where we think about the quality of our content and the engagement of our users. And we set those as two separate goals, and we measure them separately in the SERPs for us. Because obviously, if you're ranking for position 0, you also probably aren't getting that much traffic from it. So I think it's 35% of searches don't result in a click. And if that's the case, then actually you probably, as nice as visibility is in those, if you're not getting traffic, it's very difficult to justify to your boss why they're so important. So I'd finalize, I'm really early, sorry, but at least we can eat. So what I'd say is it's important to start with planning everything. So that research phase of the social listening and the forum research are probably the most important thing that you can do. And plan what the user's going to think and what their intent will be. Whilst we use a lot of like quantitative measures for how we track things, we also run all of our new content and new landing pages through user testing. So we put them on usertesting.co.uk as 2 separate landing pages and said, how did you feel about this? How did you feel about this? Pure content-based. And we asked them to answer questions. So we'll set 4 like knowledge-based questions about our content and ask them if they can go and find us the answers and see how quickly they can find the answers from our content. Those sort of qualitative measures really help us to understand how well what we've done is really being used by the user and how that will then impact how we're able to rank. For measuring everything, the thing I would suggest you start measuring immediately is your percentage ownership of the search results page. So with knowledge graphs getting answers, boxes, etc. getting bigger, and more paid ads as well, what you find is the organic real estate that you can grasp hold of is definitely reducing. Does anyone work in recruitment or like have a recruitment site they work on? Do you have Google for Jobs here yet? Possibly not yet. We got it in the UK spring this year. And Google for Jobs takes up a massive chunk of the search results. And it actually means on a typical job listing, so if you search PPC Job London, only 37% of that first page is actually organic listings. Down from what, when Google started, it was 100%, then they added ads, and now you have this huge Google for Jobs block. Like, that's crazy how little space there is for people working in SEO to actually be playing with now. So start tracking that and start measuring the value of what you're doing in terms of beyond just traffic. And then when you think you've measured everything, keep measuring and keep using the data. There's always new data points that you could be finding, could be using in this sense. So don't just stop. And don't stop measuring the impact of things, because obviously as Google's algorithm changes, the value of what we've done will change too. I think that is everything. So thank you very much. And questions if you have any.
Thanks so much, Anna. Are there any questions for her?
They're hungry. That's fine.
Okay. Thanks so much
Thanks.
again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.